Welcome into the best in true crime podcasting. This is True Crime Tuesday. I'm your host, Tim Dennis. We have an exciting show today, folks. Got to read an extremely interesting book this weekend. As a matter of fact, it's the second in the series, Murders in the Motor City. Our guest today is brbates, and she has written, again, a compelling book that I think once you pick it up, it's going to be hard to put this thing down. We find serial killers incredibly interesting on this program. This one is no exception. Benjamin Aktins was an interesting study in what happens when you abandon a child. We're going to get into it today, folks, and it's going to be a scary road we're going to travel today. The Crack City Strangler is the name of the book, The Homicides of Serial Killer Benjamin Aktins. Again, Murders in the Motor City, Book 2. brbates is our guest. brbates is a longtime author and journalist whose career includes 10 years in the daily newspaper business, as well as writing and editing work in the corporate, healthcare, ministry, and government sectors. She graduated from Michigan State University's accredited School of Journalism. Ladies and gentlemen, let's jump into it right away today, and welcome back to True Crime Tuesday, brbates. BR, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. It is great to be back, Tim.
It's a pleasure to have you back, and an absolute, as much as it can be an absolute pleasure to read about a serial killer, I think you've again outdone yourself with this book. It's absolutely chilling to read. And you know, I was talking to a good friend of mine who I'm just going to toot his horn right here, and then we'll keep going. He's won the CMA for morning show of the year the last couple of years in Nashville, and he's asking me, he's like, so what are you doing, brother? I said, I'm reading this incredibly fascinating book, but it's kind of the serial killer is kind of a wash, rinse, repeat, right? And I was trying to explain to him exactly how Benjamin Atkins would carry out his crimes. I said, it's incredibly graphic. So I'm going to put this up right now. This is not a show you listen to with kids around.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we will describe what happens with these crimes. When I described it to my friend Wayne D, he went, "Oh my God." And he doesn't get shook. I mean, you know, Wayne and I did a pro wrestling podcast together, and you know, we've been through the mud, blood, and the beer, right? And all he could say was, "Oh my God." And I went, "Yeah. That was Benjamin Aktins."
Yeah, it is not a pretty picture. He was very methodical, and he did follow a formula. Yes, rinse and repeat, as you said, for all 11 females that he killed. Definitely.
And what's interesting, BR, as you point this out, he was the nation's fastest serial killer. This guy didn't rest. It was I don't use this word lightly. It was almost like he had this demonic urge to want to run through these women.
Yeah, in a short time frame, and he was dubbed the country's fastest serial killer, and he may still have that unofficial title, although his name doesn't come up all that often in discussions of serial killers, but he was known at that time. 11 people killed. Now, he had attacked one person who survived a couple months before he took his first life. I think that probably was October 1991 that he attacked a lady named Darlene, who survived and who was very instrumental in his arrest. But it was about a month or two later, November or December, when he killed the first of the 11 women. And it was the end of May, the last day of May, that he killed the last one, C.C. Waymer. So it was about 6 to 9 months. We don't know exactly when he killed the first woman, but we know about the time frame. So it could have been as short as 6 months, which just is really scary.
Let me ask you a little bit about the way you structured the book. And I get why you did it this way. You hit us with the inhumanity first, and you chose to feature, much like in the last book, you chose to feature the victims first, and you introduce us brilliantly to the person that's there. We get to know the victim, and we get to know the person behind it. We get to know the humanity, which we should. We should get to know the victims and the victims first and the names. They shouldn't be forgotten, right? But then at the end of the book, we get to know Benjamin. And here's the deal. Most serial killers you can look at and go, boy, what a, and pardon the language, what a piece of crap, right? And you can pretty much throw it away. There's a reason why you reveal Ben Atkins at the end of the book and when he went, what he went through, and how to make a perfect serial killer, I guess. Can you tell us why you chose to reveal his history at the end of the book and not at the beginning?
Yeah, I definitely followed the same formula for both books and trying to be as victim centric as I could because I feel like it is very important to first meet each one of these women who encountered him, and especially the ones who lost their lives, because each one, of course, was a valuable human being. And so I definitely wanted to start out with that. That's my formula, I guess you would say, for both of these books so far in the series. Um, but but peeling back the layers of his backstory, I think is important as well. And he is a killer who really he gets a conflicted response from people because it's not just cut and dried. Like you look at somebody like Jeffrey Dahmer and who had absolutely horrific crimes. And there's nothing, he would have told you himself if he was still alive. And he did tell journalist Nancy Glass this back in the 1990s, shortly before he was killed behind bars, that the reason for the crimes is sitting right across from you. It wasn't some bad childhood. It wasn't some trauma I suffered, growing up, whatever. It was me. And maybe he didn't even really understand it, but he made no excuses for it. Benjamin Atkins is a lot different in that there's so many unusual and really heartbreaking circumstances in his upbringing that might make you shake your head and think, oh, wow, okay, that has to have a lot to do with it. So, yeah, he really produces a conflicted response, and he just has a lot of trauma in his background that you have to wonder, in the nature versus nurture question, if it was that kind of thing that led up to the crimes.
Wonder where we should start first. Should we start with the trauma that makes him, or should we start with his actual crimes and how he committed them? Because does the atrocity make the man, or does the trauma make the man? Which is interesting when reading this book, because when you read the atrocity, you're offended. I mean, I was just plain offended. And I don't get that way very often. I got to admit, having done this program for so long, it's hard to shake me, but this book shook me. It really did. I, I don't think I've been this shook for a long time reading these types of books. And I don't know if it's the way that you wrote it, or if it's the fact that it had happened so. Maybe it was the way you wrote it, BR. Maybe it was just the fact that when you compare and contrast to the way, the circumstances of the time frame when it happened, the fact that, when it happened in other communities, it got more attention. Because you do compare and contrast to like the Kevorkian trial, the fact that the Kevorkian trial kind of overshadowed this at times. And you do kind of rage a little bit against the light when you think about the fact that this did get buried for a while, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that
Yeah,
it.
there was
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. There was a lot of interest in the case before Atkins was identified and apprehended, when there was just a mysterious killer out there somewhere hunting women on Woodward Avenue in Detroit and Highland Park. I think it got a lot more coverage. And then when he was arrested and in his lead up to trial, there was a certain amount of waning interest. And there was also the case going on in Florida at about the same time in Gainesville, Florida. The Gainesville Ripper is what he was called, that killer, a serial killer. He was killing college co-eds. And the judge in the Atkins case up in Detroit, his name was David Kerwin, um, he even remarked about it at the time that that case in Florida was getting so much attention. And these were nice, pretty, white college co-ed females. So contrast with the victims in the Atkins case. These were women of color living at risk on the street, drug addicted, and working prostitution. So you have to wonder, okay, is that what was going on? But he made the point that Court TV had requested permission to televise the Atkins trial. There was that much interest in it. CNN had talked to the defense attorney. There were a lot of interviews going on and a lot of attention, a lot of spotlight. But then when it came time to trial, it's like really the media didn't really show up like you thought they were going to. Court TV was nowhere to be found. I don't know if they actually got the permission. I tried to contact them myself and I could not get a response, but I was curious to see if they did get permission to televise the trial and then just didn't follow up with it. But there was a marked waning interest by the time this case was being resolved, tried, and Atkins getting convicted. So it is interesting from a cultural perspective.
It is. And when you think about that time frame too, 91, 92, you're talking about pre LA riots. I mean, that would have been pre LA riots, so it wasn't quite sexy yet to throw it on the front page. It would have got washed over for other things that would have maybe been bigger in scope, maybe even regionally or nationally. And there would have been things that probably would have taken it over, even temporarily. You could have come back to it. I'm just thinking like a news editor, like I'm sure you would, thinking, okay, well, we can always come back to it. This is something that I think will probably stay in the headlines for at least a few weeks. You wouldn't think that it would have a quick resolve to it. Maybe the trial would go for a month or so, a month or two, right? You could always pop in and out. But yeah, I don't get why it didn't receive more of a spotlight, I guess is the way I want to put it. Right.
Yeah, you mentioned Kevorkian. Kevorkian was definitely in the news a lot. There also was the Nancy Kerrigan incident, which
Yes.
happened in Detroit. So as far as Detroit news, there was some other stuff going on that was big in the headlines. And I remember the day that Atkins was convicted, it was on the front page of the papers, but down on the bottom and jumping inside after a couple inches. So, it wasn't plastered across the paper above the fold or anything,
Well, and
just to set that context.
nationally, the Kerrigan thing was just insane. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there was no reason for it to go that nuts, and the Galooly thing was just stupid. I mean, it was it got more press than it should have for what it was. Yeah. So I mean, all of us who were around at that time, I think, even probably would admit that it got more traction than it should have. So
Yep.
sometimes the media misses big time with a story.
I guess, you just guess what's going to be appealing to people, and figure skaters are always popular. So the scandal of it all, the strangeness of it all must have figured like, okay, this story has really got a lot of legs, whereas the serial killer killing 11 women on Woodward Avenue, maybe not. I don't know. It's crazy.
Well, when we look at it from 2025 eyes, and
Mm-hmm.
how people now, I don't want to use the word obsess over true crime, but I mean, really, there's a focus on true crime. When you stack up the case of Benjamin Atkins versus Jeff Galooly, I think, I think
Right.
the tables have turned a little bit in 2025. I think people would probably be a little bit more interested in Benjamin Atkins than they would Jeff Galooly. I mean, it's kind of looked at as silly now. A crowbar to the leg is a little less important than 11 people losing their lives.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, for sure. That's for sure. Um, I want to talk a little bit about why don't we go into the actual act? And this is where it's going to get a little not safe for work here, and how he would commit his crimes, how Ben would commit his crimes. And then I tell you what, we'll take a break. And then I want to talk a little bit about his upbringing and how exactly you make this type of serial killer. And we'll go in a little bit about how he was caught. Um, the act itself, it was horrendous. Is the only way to describe it. Abhorrent is another word that comes to mind. Br. Um, and really made no sense. But again, when you're strung out on crack, there's not a lot that makes sense. I mean, it kind of takes from the sensibilities. But in the same respect, when it came to Benjamin Atkins, he kind of claimed he wasn't in full control. Can you kind of explain to our audience why he claimed he wasn't quite all there, and then exactly what would happen when he would come across one of his victims? He introduced the element of crack as a way to get to his victims, but then it went from there.
Yeah, very much so. Um, he was a homeless person. He was living on the street. Sometimes he would stay with his brother. He had a brother who was 1 year older, and the two of them were very close throughout their lives. And so sometimes he would stay at his brother's place with his brother and his brother's girlfriend. Most of the time, though, Ben was homeless and he was sleeping in abandoned buildings along Woodward Avenue. And he was part of the homeless culture, part of the street culture there. He was going to crack houses to make his purchases, and he saw these women. I think probably a lot of these women had seen him around, knew him by the street name Tony, and would be like, oh, okay, there's Tony, whatever, I've seen him around. He was a familiar sight. And I think that probably helped him in luring each one of these women with the crack, is that he was disarming in that way. These were females who were working, who were doing sex work. But when he would approach them, it would be so casual, like, hey, I got something. Do you want to go smoke? And it wasn't about a sexual act so much. It was inviting them to just share. He got a rock at such and such house or whatever. So let's go smoke. It's on me, or, whatever casual encounter that would entail. And so there was no sense of threat for them. I think he was just somebody that they saw around. This was not a John. But then typically they would go to an abandoned building and they would hang out and they would start lighting up. And there were some other people who knew Atkins, even just casually, maybe didn't smoke with him, but maybe the lady who lived in the building where he stayed sometimes or whatever. Um, who told the media after his arrest that he became a different person when he started smoking crack. And it was likened to something demonic. And so when he would take a female off to some dark corner of Woodward Avenue and they would start smoking crack, he would often become someone else. And he does have two survivors that are known of. And one of them I was able to interview. The other has passed on since then, Darlene, but I was able to interview a gal named Margie who said very much when he got high, he was somebody different, very much. And so that's how these encounters would tend to go. Then things would go sideways. And then he would start attacking the woman. He would rape her. He would rape her different ways, not to get too graphic about that.
Right.
He would strangle her so that she would pass out. He would bind her, typically with hands behind her back, and just to subdue her and rape her. She would pass out. Often she would wake back up, because that's something that happens when you get strangled. Is it takes a long time. It takes probably longer than people realize to strangle someone. And so often someone who's being strangled will then wake up. Sometimes he would allow them to wake up on purpose. He later told police sometimes they would just wake up. And so he would strangle them again. This was a repeated process. Eventually, he would kill them and he would make sure that each one was dead. So when he had strangled the woman, he would press on her chest, make sure all the air was out of her lungs. He would listen for breathing. He would check for a pulse. He had read in a book how to do this. He was intent on making sure that she could not report him to police. So that was the pattern he followed. Um, and then he would leave. He would make an effort to hide her. He wasn't leaving these women out in the open. He was leaving them in a dark corner, like I said, and he would make an effort to hide them. So that's why a lot of them were not found for several weeks or even months. But yeah, he tended to follow the same pattern or formula with each female.
There were a few of them even that, I mean, this is just disturbing that people would smell odors and then
Mm-hmm.
it would report that they would smell something weird or they would notice and one or two of these buildings even had high traffic
Mm-hmm.
and they were smelling these odors, which is just it's so disturbing, BR, that I mean, a few of these buildings were, I mean, technically quote unquote abandoned buildings, or they were construction sites or whatever they were. Um, but they had traffic and people were smelling these odors and went, oh, but life continued.
Mm-hmm. For a period of time, Highland Park. See, some of these crimes happened in Detroit. 3 of the women were killed in Detroit. 8 of them were killed in Highland Park. And so a lot of this case was centered in Highland Park. And Highland Park was a city that had a lot of financial trouble at that point in the early 1990s. And they had stopped collecting trash. And so when you talk about a smell coming out of a building, one cop I interviewed said, yeah, the city stopped collecting trash. So it was not at all that unusual if you walk by a building and if it's getting warm out, it's spring or summer that year in 1992, and you smell something coming out of the building, it really wouldn't surprise you because there was just trash everywhere. People would take their trash and put it in an abandoned building because it wasn't being collected. That was the point that he was making. I'm like, oh, wow. So that was the trouble with one of the gals when she was discovered, Joanne O'Rourke. I think she was finally discovered by a scrapper, but there had been a smell coming out of that building for weeks. And there was a shop owner nearby that said, yeah, I called the police about it and they didn't do anything. And, or else she would have, if they had listened to that shopkeeper, then Joanne would have been discovered sooner. So yeah, just crazy conditions for these women to be left in these buildings. And yeah, talking about heavy traffic, yes, a lot of them were used for drug use, for prostitution. A lot of them were heavy traffic areas. I saw the crime scene video of the Monterey Motel when the 3 women were found there. And every room they go into, each one of the 3 rooms where the women were found, the floor is just covered with junk, debris, wrappers, cigarettes, used condoms, whatever. There's pieces of the room that were torn down because people go in there to look for stuff and they tear it all up. So every room, it's very chilling and very creepy because the video is dark and there's just junk everywhere. It's like a trash heap. It just was so disturbing.
And the state of decay that some of the bodies are in. Again, I'll leave it for people to read it in the book. I don't know how people could have gone in and out of those rooms, done whatever business they decided they were going to do in those rooms, have smelled that smell of decay
Yep.
and thought to themselves, everything's fine in this room. Even if you're going in to smoke up whatever drug you're going to smoke up, go do whatever sexual business you're going to do in those rooms, to think that you could get to a base animal instinct of doing whatever business you're going to do in that room, yet still smell what you know is death in that room, that tells you how bad in addiction you are, that you can ignore that.
Yep.
Because you have to know in your brain something's not right.
And Atkins himself was continuing to sleep in rooms at the Monterey Motel after he was leaving some of the women there, 3 women, as I said. Police asked him, "How could you stay there after you'd killed women there?" "Well, I just went to another room." That's
Yeah.
what he said.
And how is your soul at peace with that? I mean, you have to be psychotic and be able to turn that off to know that there are 3 bodies that had souls, that you extinguish that light and they're decaying in other rooms and you were responsible for that. You did that. Yet you can sleep peacefully in another room.
And that's where you get into what Atkins claimed. He claimed, and I think this addresses something that you had said earlier, is how can he, essentially, how can any of this be justified, or how can he be held responsible for his crimes? He claimed after he was arrested and as he was being evaluated by psychiatrists in his, or psychologists in the lead up to his trial, he claimed to hear voices. He claimed to have sort of alternate personalities living within him that were telling him to commit the crimes. The one dominant one was ironically named Tony, his street name, and he seemed to be the aggressor who was telling Atkins to go kill these women, who was berating him because Atkins was actually working prostitution himself. That was another reason I think he was disarming to these females, is maybe they had seen him around meeting with some male Johns and knew what he was doing and figured, okay, he's not interested in me in that way. He's a prostitute himself. So I don't have to worry. He's just, somebody I see around, like I said. So he he claimed that Tony was a voice who was giving him this instruction. There were also a couple other sort of alternate personalities that he claimed were influencing him. And so, the reader can decide for themselves with the facts of the case. Okay, do you think he was actually hearing this, or was this a certain amount of subterfuge that he was throwing out there for his defense or for the benefit of the cops? I don't know. It's interesting from a psychological perspective.
And again, folks, I encourage you to read the book, The Crack City Strangler, The Homicides of Serial Killer Benjamin Atkins, because what experts say was going on is interesting with him and whether those voices were real or not. That whole can of worms is very interesting as well. I tell you what, BR, we're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit about how police eventually uh, get to Benjamin Atkins, how they get him and how they find him, how they arrest him, how they bring him in, and what that whole scenario is like. And then I want to talk a little bit about his upbringing, and I want to talk about how exactly you make this kind of character. Is this manufactured? Do we manufacture serial killers like this, or is this truly nature? Is this nature versus nurture? Is this something where you cook this type of serial killer up? Is this a formulaic type deal? Or was this person broken from the beginning? The name of the book is The Crack City Strangler, The Homicides of Serial Killer Benjamin Atkins, Murders in the Motor City, Book 2. B.R. Bates is the author of this incredibly interesting book. We have a link in the description of this program. I encourage you to go get it, folks. I got to tell you, I was absolutely chilled by it. I may seem like I'm a little bit subdued right now. I'm in awe. That's all I got to tell you. This book shook me. I don't get shook by books very often. BR is incredibly talented, folks, and there is the first book in this series, the Baby Doll Serial Killer, the John Eric Armstrong Homicides. Again, the first book in this series was incredibly good as well. Both are available by Wild Blue Press, and I encourage you to pick up both of them. But again, the Crack City Strangler is the latest. When we come back, we'll talk about Benjamin Atkins and about how police were on his trail and how they brought him in, and we'll talk a little bit about just about how you make a serial killer like this. When we come back with B.R. Bates right here on the best in true crime podcasting, this is True Crime Tuesday. Welcome back to the best in true crime podcasting. This is True Crime Tuesday. I'm your host, Tim Dennis. My guest is brbates. The name of the book is The Crack City Strangler, The Homicides of Serial Killer Benjamin Aktins. It is Murders in the Motor City, Book 2. BR, when we left people at the break, we were talking a little bit about the, I hate to say, the mechanism of how Benjamin did his crimes. I want to talk a little bit now about how police were trying to figure out how to bring him in, because it's a little tough when you first figure out you have a serial killer, you have something going on in the street. It's especially with the drug community. Um, it's a tough community to crack or to get into, and I don't use crack as a pun here. People may think I did, but I didn't. Um, but to get that information at first is hard to get. But it turns out, or as it turns out, there was someone who came forward at first and said, "Hey, you gotta check this guy out. There's something not right." But police didn't necessarily listen at first, did they?
It was crazy. Darlene Saunders, she had been, as I mentioned, attacked by Atkins in October 1991, around October. It's possible it was September, but it probably was October. And she knew him before that. She knew him for a few years. She knew a gal on the street who she said was his sister. I don't know if it was actually his sister or his brother's girlfriend or just someone else that he referred to as his sister. But, anyways, she knew Tony and again was disarmed by the fact that he was just somebody who hung out. So, no harm in him. But when she was attacked, it bothered her. She did not go to police because a lot of women in this situation, they actually get attacked a lot in this kind of work, in sex work. And so she had seen him a time or two after that. In fact, they ran into each other at a crack house and he held the door for her as she was going in. And she said, "Why did you do that to me, Tony?" And he said, "I don't want to talk about it." He just shut her down. And so it bothered her, but she did not go to police. Well, then in February of 1992, the three women were found at the Monterey. And when she heard the news about that, it was so unsettling for her. For one thing, she knew one of the women who it turned out was identified at the Monterey, Valerie Chalk. Their kids knew each other, their kids went to school together. And that really bothered her a lot. But also, she could just feel in her heart, she could feel that that could be Tony, the guy she knew as Tony.
Mm-hmm.
And so finally, she convinced herself the next month, March, to go to police. And she filed a report. She sat down with an officer and filed a report, but it went nowhere. It did not get any attention at all. The police in Highland Park, the public safety unit, they knew Darlene. She had been a business owner. She and her husband had owned a hardware store and they were known around town. Highland Park had a bit of a small town feel, at least back then. And so they were like, come on, Darlene, just go home. Go home. I mean, they knew what she was doing these days, that she was on the street, that she was into drugs. And so they just basically shook her head and sent her home. That's what her son told me.
Mm-hmm.
So that report was ignored all the way until this investigation really heated up and the women continued to turn up, and a lot of women. And finally, in the summer, there was someone that Darlene knew in her family who called police and really put the heat on them and said, "Hey, you had an incident reported with this guy and you haven't even looked into it. And this is a valid lead here. You really need to look into it." And there was a police officer that Darlene knew also in Highland Park Public Safety. And between the two of them, they finally got some attention for this. And then the Highland Park police had Darlene come in July, I think it was, and give her story again. And then from that, she was assigned to a Michigan State trooper who was helping work the case. And he took her around Woodward Avenue in the evenings. And finally, after a few weeks of riding around together and roaming around on foot together, he and Darlene were able to spot Tony, and Tony was apprehended.
But it took a while for them to listen. And it took a
Mm-hmm.
while for them to, and thank God Darlene was persistent and people around Darlene were persistent.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they
Otherwise,
valued her story. They valued her and they valued her story, whereas police just brushed it off at
yeah,
first.
otherwise, how many more women would have died? You know?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And I mean, you can play the what if scenario all day long, BR, but I mean, you think about the pace that Benjamin was at, and how it didn't seem like, I mean, even though he made claims that at one time he had what was it? He had found religion, or he had pulled back a little bit, or he had made excuses to authorities that, well, he was trying to temper himself a little bit. But he was on a holy terror for quite a while. And whether you want to blame the drugs, whether you want to blame voices, whether you want to blame mental illness, whether you want to blame a bad upbringing, I honestly believe that it was just pure psychopathic rage at his circumstances when you look at his upbringing. And I guess we can make that transition and talk about his upbringing, because you know when you talk about strangulation, I want to get back to his modus operandi. Strangulation, when you talk to criminal psychologists, they talk about how strangulation is so incredibly personal. When you kill somebody by strangulation, it's up close, it's personal, and it takes a long time, as you pointed out. It's an incredible amount of effort, and you have to watch someone slowly die, and you have to be focused, and it's incredibly intimate. Everything about the way he killed a woman was intimate, plain and simple. He wasn't insane. There was nothing about him that was insane. As far as the clinical definition of it, he knew what he was doing. He was angry. He was angry at his circumstances. He was angry at what he had been put through. And if you want to break things down psychologically, at least the way I read your book and the way I read things, he really was angry at his upbringing. And every time he killed a woman, he was killing his mother.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were different cops who worked the case who said that very thing, that he was killing his mom over and over and over again.
Yeah. But what's insane is he also raped his mother at the same time.
Yeah, that there's so many aspects of this that I mean, if you're really into psychology and you sit down with all of this, I think it's fascinating just trying to paw through the pieces, the jigsaw puzzle pieces in the box and make sense of them and trying to put them into some kind of order, because it's hard. It's really hard. Yeah, he grew up without a father and he never knew his father. His father left his mom when Ben was 2 years old and Ben's brother was 3. And back then, Judy is their mom. She was living in Ohio. And so at that point that their dad left, she moved back to Michigan where she was from and she lived with her mom for a while. But Judy was addicted to heroin. She was working prostitution. And the thing was, the widely known fact after Atkins' arrest was, and Atkins talked about this very openly, and Judy herself was pretty open about everything, all of the different facets of her own life when she spoke with the defense attorney and anyone else with the case. But she took the 2 boys with her when she was working prostitution. And Ben talked about sitting in the back seat of a car. He might have been 4 or 5 years old with his mom in the front with a trick. witnessing that. So that's the kind of trauma he experienced early on that he didn't even really understand. But he told police, well, I kind of realized what was going on, and it's horrifying to think that a little child is desensitized to that kind of behavior. But Judy was largely absent in the boys' lives. And so at a certain point, they became wards of the county. She had left them with someone that she knew. And then the authorities realized this. Someone discovered this, and they're like, okay, this lady has taken off and left her kids with, an acquaintance. And so they were made wards of the county, and they went into the foster care system. They went through probably 3 or 4 homes in the next several years. And at one point, they were causing a lot of trouble. They were skipping school, they were running away. And so the last foster home that they were in contacted the county, contacted Children's Services, and said, we've got our hands full. We just can't do this anymore. Can you all place these 2 kids somewhere else, because we can't do it. And so they were really wearing down the system. And at that point, the 2 boys were assigned to a home for boys in Detroit called St. Francis. It was run by the Catholic diocese, and they spent 2 years there. Ben was about 9, almost 10, so he stayed there from about 10 until age 12. And that was a very important time in his life, and not in a good way. I did talk to a couple people who lived there at St. Francis about the same time he did. One of them actually encountered Atkins and was assaulted by him, he said. He was a younger boy, a year or 2 younger than him. So that's a whole other story. So Ben was acting out at the home, definitely acting out, and in sometimes violent ways. But apart from that, he does claim that there was a male staff member who abused him. He describes it different ways at different times to different people in the time between his arrest and his trial, the year and a half or so when he was being evaluated by 4 different psychologists / psychiatrists. And so sometimes and even with his defense attorney, sometimes he would say this person abused him. Sometimes he explained it as, well, I wanted to hang out with him, and there was someone else, there was another kid that he started paying attention to instead of me. And so I wanted his attention back, and I gave him sexual favors to keep that attention. So there's something very twisted about this situation, and we don't really understand the nature of the situation. But we do know, if his account is any way to be believed, that he had a male staff member at that facility who was very inappropriate with him at a very young age, and that went into all of his experiences, his negative experiences that, as you said, could be cooking a killer, a criminal, you have to argue.
Yeah.
So even after those 2 years, when the 2 boys were discharged back to their mom had been working on trying to get a legit life, trying to get a job, trying to find a decent place to live to support the boys. And even in the progress reports of Benjamin at the home, the nuns were the ones who were taking the reports, and they describe Judy's efforts to make a legitimate life for the boys. And all the time, Benjamin, what I find very interesting about that time at the home, and what the nuns note in these reports, is that the whole time Ben wanted to be back with his mom and his brother. He wanted the 3 of them to be together again. That was his world. No matter what his mom did, no matter the fact that she was largely absent, and she would come visit him at the home for boys, but sometimes she wouldn't. Sometimes she would say she was going to show up, and she blew it off and she didn't show up. No matter what she did, he always wanted to be back with her. So his relationship with his mom is complicated as a little boy and as an adult. And so they were after a couple of years, discharged back into their mom's care. But again, she was absent. She was off doing her thing, and she had a string of different boyfriends. And that's where, again, Ben got into an abusive situation. He said that one of Judy's boyfriends essentially sold him into a sexual relationship with a guy that he knew. So again, abusive things happening to him. And Ben's brother told the defense attorney after the arrest that, yeah, during that time, we were young teenagers. We were just left to our own devices. And Ben started hustling on the street, and he started doing drugs, different kinds of drugs, experimenting with them. And he started working prostitution himself because he realized, okay, I can get money for this. I can get money.
Yeah.
So he was going out to the street and embarking on that behavior too to get drugs. And so it was just really a mess, and this went on and on for a few years. He had girlfriends at times, and he had boyfriends at times, and he was very honest with police about that. At first he claimed to be gay, and so he couldn't have committed these murders of the women because he wasn't interested in females. He said, I'm gay, I have boyfriends. But no, later, as he continued talking with police, he admitted that he had had girlfriends and boyfriends over the years. He was very conflicted about his sexuality, for one thing. But things escalated for him. And by the time he was 22, 21, 22, he was starting to attack these women. And that's where we pick up our story leading up to his arrest and the murders of these 11 women.
It almost seems like, and I think you'll agree, he almost started striking out violently to get his mother's attention. And he just kept doing it and kept doing it, hoping that, you know what, this is going to be the only way that mom's going to pay attention to me. If I keep acting out and keep acting out, eventually she's going to notice me and she's going to come love me.
Yep, that's an interesting thought.
And she never did because she was too self-absorbed. He was never going to get her attention because she didn't have it in her to give him that type of attention. It was a fruitless mission on his part, on his part, and it just kept escalating and escalating. He was out of control already, but um, it's sad. It's very sad, but it also seems like there was no one there to step in and intervene and tell him, you know, that's not the proper way to go about things and turn him around at the same time, which also is sad. Um, there's also another thing here that's sad as well, and that is that, and I want to leave quite a bit here, quite a bit of meat still on the bone, so that people can read the book. But I do want to, as we start to wrap things up here, again, because I want to leave quite a bit of meat on the bone for people to read about. I do want to let people know that Benjamin Aktins ended up being HIV positive.
Mm-hmm.
So he committed a lot of these rapes being HIV positive, and he wasn't always safe about what he was doing.
It was interesting. He sometimes used a condom. Okay.
Sometimes.
With Valerie Chalk. You know, the prosecuting attorney, Michael Reynolds, made a sort of joke at the time that this was the first safe sex serial killer we've heard of. Well, he didn't use a condom every time, I don't think, but he did use a condom some of the time. And there's a whole other discussion you could have about that because, yes, he died with HIV in 1997. And we knew back then, those of us who were around back then, we knew that when HIV and AIDS first came on the pop culture landscape or came into our culture, came on the radar, before the technological advancements, the scientific advancements, your life expectancy when you were diagnosed or when you contracted HIV was about 10 years. It was estimated to be about 10 years. And so if you count back from 1997, you have to think that he was infected with HIV while these crimes were taking place. So is it possible that was in there somewhere? And is it possible, and I know that there are medical records of when he would go to clinics, he would go to places in Detroit and get tested for different things. He was conscious of that. There are records in the files right now of him being tested for syphilis and things like that. So I have to wonder if he had anonymous testing and he did learn he was HIV positive somewhere in there, somewhere before the crimes. And because he figured, okay, I'm living the street life, I'm doing drugs with people, I'm smoking crack, I'm doing other drugs too, and I'm having homosexual relations, I'm doing prostitution with men, I am also doing these sexual relations with females too. I'm raping them and whatever is going on. So it's weird that he would choose to use a condom. It I mean, I have to wonder if he was aware of his HIV status and he was trying to be careful about getting anything else, maybe.
Maybe.
Or if he was just conscious because everybody was talking about it at the time and safe sex was starting to become a thing in the late 80s, early 90s. People were talking about that. So maybe he was just deciding he would protect himself so that he didn't get something. And maybe he only learned later that he was HIV positive. I don't know. It does open up this whole discussion, though, I really think.
The only other thing I can think of is we were at the very forefront of DNA evidence too. So
Right.
he might have been thinking about potential DNA spread.
Yes, that is a good point. Although at the Valerie Chalk scene, he left the condom there with
That's
his sample in it.
that's true.
So
Yeah. So that does,
you would
yeah,
think,
you're right. It
okay,
doesn't
maybe
work.
it was about, he honestly was trying to protect himself. I don't
Right.
know.
Right. You're right. You're right about that. Um, and that begs one other question here too. Just knowing the little bit I know about that particular era, AZT was the one drug that they were treating with at the time with HIV. I wonder, and there were plenty of free clinics at that time that were distributing AZT, especially to the homeless population. I wonder, was he ever getting AZT at the time to help treat his HIV? Not that it would put it in remission, because it certainly, with some people it did, with some people it didn't. Um, but if he ever stopped to try to take care of himself at any time with AZT, or if he just let it run wild.
Yeah, you would think because if he did even get an anonymous test, which at the time I do remember this, I remember hearing about this in college, that you could honestly go get an HIV test and never reveal your identity. You could be assigned a number, and even the person doing the testing and meeting with you later to deliver the results personally would only know that number and would not know the name. So that would not be on record anywhere. But if you came back HIV positive, yes, you would think that that person is going to refer you for some kind of treatment or care. There's going to be some kind of, they're going to want to do some follow up. So
Yeah.
I don't know if any of that ever happened for them.
I don't know. That's a good question. I would hope, for other people's sake, that had contact with him, that he had at least tried to take care of himself, because that, in those days especially, it was important to
Mm-hmm.
try and contain spread. So
Yep.
you know just for other people's sake, not necessarily for his, but for other people's, that's for sure. um BR, you've outdone yourself again. This book is amazing. It is one that, I'll tell you this much: if you're a fan of the serial killer genre and you're looking for a book that is riveting, and you do something in this book that I also find amazing. You also take and you compare Benjamin Atkins to other serial killers and different motives, and you connect those threads um in motives and how he compares to others, and you make that cross reference. And at one point my head is swimming, I got to tell you that. It's it was almost like I don't know how to put this, BR, other than it was almost like I'm sitting in front of the Dalai Lama of serial killer knowledge, and I'm like, okay, fill me with more. I want to know more about how he relates in the lexicon of serial killers almost. And you put it brilliantly, how important this case really is the best way to put it. You frame it brilliantly, why this is so important. And I think that that's the epitome of a good book, when you sit down and you frame this case and say, you know what, this is why it matters. and someone can sit down and go, oh, okay, I get it, right? It's not just putting it out there for the sake of putting it out there, right? Or having another subject to put out there, but you put it out there and say, this is why it matters. And it does matter. And not that any murder doesn't matter, but that this is why it especially matters. And I came away from it not only being shocked and awed, but I came away from it going, well, by God, there's been an injustice here, that this isn't remembered more. And that you, thank God, have put it together so that we can memorialize it in a much better way. So for that, I think.
Thank you. That is wonderful. Those are wonderful words. I really appreciate it.
So the book, folks, is The Crack City Strangler, the homicides of serial killer Benjamin Aktins, Murders in the Motor City, Book 2. I'll ask you this before we leave you, BR. Is there a book 3?
Not yet. There was another case in Detroit of a serial killer I would love to write about, but I know someone else, a colleague that I used to work with at the Detroit News, that is interested in doing that book. I guess I need to check with him to see if he's still planning on it. I don't know. He's done true crime himself, but I think that is an unsolved case, and it would make a really good book. I would love to do that if he is not planning to, but who knows what'll happen.
Between you, me, and the fence post, here's hoping he drops the ball.
Well, even if he did, somebody's got to tell the story. So I hope one of us does.
That's right. Well, here's hoping there's a book 3. I'd like to see a book 3 out of you.
Thank you.
I think this series is incredibly entertaining and incredibly educational. And I wish you the best of luck with Crack City Strangler. That's for sure.
Thank you.
For more audio and video archives of True Crime Tuesday, intriguing content, and cool swag, check out darknessradioshow.com. The executive producer of True Crime Tuesday is Troy Palmer. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw, be sure to like and subscribe. Be sure to join us tomorrow for Supernatural News with Mally Fox.